I got to unmute. All right. So welcome back again today. Today I'm going to go a little bit into the engine itself, talk about some of the technologies that we're starting to see out there. I'm going to start talking about kind of tying all of the things we've covered over the last couple months together as well. There'll be little pieces of it, and a little bit will even lead into tomorrow. So with that, let's get started. So this is a seminar that I did last summer. It's really talking about ICE as an emission controller, the internal combustion engine. All of the things that we do with vehicles these days are to try and improve efficiency. You know, when we first got into emission controls way back in the 70s, it was about just treating the exhaust, and we lost a lot of efficiency in engines. And today we see engines being modified to help control these emissions and do a better job. So with that, let's get going. One of the things I always like to talk about whenever teaching any kind of combustion class is, what do you need to light a fire? And really, in this case here, if I took this match and this big block of wood, it would probably be a futile effort. You know, one of the things is that how wood burns is really we got to get it hot enough to vaporize. And so, you know, all the Boy Scouts out there know that you got to create some kindling and you got to add some air so that you can actually get this thing burning. And that way we can heat this wood up and get it to start vaporizing and get us a gas, and it's really the hydrogen that's going to be evaporating out of there that we can burn. And there is success. And just to prove what this has to do with cars, this is a technology that's been around forever, and it's actually getting more popular now, is where you can actually build a gasifier and run your car off of the wood gas that's created by this thing. So there's a lot of the, you know, the preppers in the world that really like these things and have figured out ways to run their cars. Anyway, getting into the combustion triangle. If we're talking about fuel and emissions, we got to start thinking about what do we need to get a burn. So we need air, fuel, and an ignition. In the case of ignition, it could be the spark from a gasoline engine or the compression heat from a diesel engine. Or there are compression ignition engines out there too in the gasoline world that are being played with. So if we think about what we put into the engine, it's 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and 1% other gases. The fuel, be it gasoline or diesel, is the hydrocarbon, and I guess we should add ethanol or methanol to that as well, depending on what's being used. And like I said, where do we get our ignition sources? The equation typically for a complete combustion reaction is if we take the fuel and oxygen, the results should be CO2 and water. So if we use a pure fuel, like if we used hydrogen with oxygen, those are the two things that should come out of the tailpipe. However, that's not what we're putting in, so we have residuals that are going to come out. What's the major component we put in the engine besides fuel and oxygen? What's the actual working fluid of the engine was a question that was posed to me one time. And, you know, we talk about compression and expansion and all those things within an engine, and really it's the nitrogen. You know, that's 78% nitrogen that we use to make the engine work. You know, we're going to apply the heat to the nitrogen. We're going to get the burn. That nitrogen is going to help in moving the pistons. It's going to not be consumed in the process. It would get combined with some other things, and that's really what we're going to be talking about. So exiting out of the engine after we've completed combustion, we're going to have our hydrocarbons, possibly from result of incomplete combustion. CO, or carbon monoxide, is the mixture-related gas. Depending if it's rich, we might have some carbon monoxide. Oxygen, again, water, nitrogen, and nitrogen oxides. The other one that's there too is CO2, and that's the one lately that's come under fire. And Dick will talk tomorrow about some of the things around CO2 and when he's talking to his air conditioning class. So we'll be investigating that as well. So if we talk about emissions, just some things to think about. Which of those emissions are regulated? How are they formed? How have they been controlled? And how are we controlling them today? So one of the things we're doing out there is engines with variable valve actuation. So for a long time, with camshafts being the brain of an engine, we dealt with this, is that, we had a certain timing of the valve action in a particular cylinder. We wanted to open the intake valve prior to the intake stroke beginning, and we close it typically after. We go through our compression cycle after we've closed the valve pistons, moving back up again. We get into the power stroke, which is after ignition. Usually we light the fire before top dead center, so we get the power stroke. And somewhere near the end of the power stroke, we're going to open the exhaust valve and let the gases out and start the whole process over. We have a section of time where exhaust and intake are open simultaneously, typically called overlap. We're going to deal with things like cylinder filling and all of those that can be controlled with this variable system. Other things that we may do too is we may not only play with intake opening and exhaust closing, but we may also play around with exhaust opening and intake closing. So there's some different technologies there for that as well. Here is a video I took last year, and I want you to watch the valves and just see what happens here. It's going to repeat one more time. And one of the things to notice out of that is that there is no overlap in that particular situation. That cylinder head is one of our products. It's our cutaway GDI cylinder head, and it has variable cam actuators. And as it sits in its static form, it has no valve overlap. So I'm going to just jump to a little demonstration here. This is one of the sections in Electude, and this is showing a camshaft with a variable cam actuator, and we can see these two humps here that represent the exhaust and the intake. And we have the ability to move this little slider here and show how the camshaft can move without the gear actually moving. So by using oil pressure inside that actuator, we can actually force the camshaft to move, and you can actually see down below in the little graph how we can move from no overlap to having lots of overlap. And so by playing around with that, we can actually change what's going on at the cylinder depending on the needs of the engine. A lot of these actuators have a fixed position that they start from. There'll be a spring or some kind of locking mechanism that will hold them in one position. And then as we operate the engine, they can start varying. Another form of variable valve, or really this gets into variable displacement, is we have engines out there that have the ability to stop moving the valves altogether. So in the case here, this is a cylinder activation where we've got a double-bodied lifter that we can actually, again, disengage one section so that the lifter body itself moves up and down without actually moving the push rod and opening the valve. So this will give us the ability to run a V8 engine, for example, on 4 cylinders or 6 cylinders and change the combination. So again, trying to improve the efficiency of the engine, because in a lot of cases when you have a V8, you don't really need all of the power all the time. So this way we can actually deactivate it. And this is only a sample of some of the ones where you can change displacement. There are now rocker arms on V6 engines that'll do similar things. Bunch of ways to deactivate cylinders. Go into older technology, VTEC Hondas, where we could change the valve lift by engaging different rocker arms on different size lobes, those types of things as well. And then we can get into all of the newer valve technologies today where there's variable lift. So we can actually change the amount of lift either by using some sort of lever. There are some where we change the ratio of the rocker arm. Lots of different valve technologies, but then again, it's all to try and get the right valve timing for the engine so that we can improve the efficiency of it. If you've ever driven anything from the old days that had a performance camshaft in it, you used to be able to almost feel the torque curve. There was a point where the camshaft made a lot of power. You could just feel it come in and again lay down. And if you start looking at dyno charts from a lot of engines these days, you'll see a very flat torque curve. And a lot of that has to do with valve actuation so that, it's feeding the engine what it needs at the time to get the best performance out of it. So again, back to this, we talked about what happens if we play around with the position of these events. So I'm going to, not that you're going to be doing the assignment, but thinking about this, if we change valve opening time or valve closing time, how will it affect the engine operation? How is it beneficial? And what emissions are we trying to control? So there's just the things to think about it. I'm going to bring up the next slide here for a minute and let you just ponder these for a minute. So yesterday we talked about the power split device, and we said that the common thing that we referred to was the Toyota Prius. Well, the Toyota Prius uses the technology from the top of the list there, late intake valve closing. And probably a lot of you are aware what that is, but typically that's what we refer to as the Atkinson cycle. So by delaying the closing of the intake valve, we're reducing pumping or increasing pumping efficiencies. What we're doing is we're actually letting the piston rise in the cylinder on the compression stroke a little bit longer before closing the valve, and that takes away some of the resistance to it moving. And then at the end, we close it very quickly and get a sharp rise in pressure, and we still get the effect. The second one, early intake valve closing, was another modified engine, typically referred to as a Miller cycle. Now, Miller sometimes did either or, the late intake valve closing or the early intake valve closing, and both had the same effect. Essentially, they were to reduce pumping losses again, to either by taking less air in at the beginning or delaying when we actually compress it. Again, those two things are going to increase the efficiency of the engine, make it seem like a slightly smaller displacement, and reduce overall emissions. If we go into early intake valve opening, it's one that we started doing lately, well, for quite a while now. A common thing that we had on a lot of gasoline engines was an EGR valve, and you don't see a lot of those anymore. So one of the things we're able to do is actually do the exhaust gas recirculation by early intake valve opening. What this does is allows some of the exhaust to actually go back up through the intake valve. It'll get cooled while it's in the intake and then actually be drawn back into the cylinder and take up some of the space, creating that inert gas. And that's really what EGR did, is that we took some of the exhaust gases and recirculated them back through the intake and put them into the cylinder, and again to take up some of the space to try and reduce the overall compression ratio and the temperature of combustion. Last one, early or late exhaust valve closing, and this really has to do with more how much we fill the cylinder. Thinking of, again, the old muscle car with the lumpy cam, in the overlap range, sometimes we would late exhaust valve closing, just again try and get as much into the cylinder as possible, because as that hot exhaust rushed out of the cylinder and down the exhaust pipe, it actually left a negative pressure behind it, which actually would help with cylinder filling. So when you see tuned exhaust on engines, those types of things, a lot of that is more to do with the cylinder filling after the exhaust event, so that we get a larger charge in the cylinder. And again, just more efficient operation altogether. With all of this variation, this is one of from the Picoscope. You can actually go to their website and look at this. But this has become a diagnostic process that a lot of people are going through, is that how do I know if I've got problems with my variable valve timing? So you see a lot of people now using pressure transducers and putting them in the cylinder, removing the spark plug, putting this in the cylinder, and actually run the engine on the other cylinders and record an event and actually go and watch these peaks and see what's actually going on in the cylinder. And in the software, it's actually got all of the ways to overlap the trigger that you use, be the crank sensor, whatever, and see what's going on with these events. So these events are all 180 degrees apart. So the large rise there in pressure is your compression stroke. As the piston moves down, and because we didn't fire the cylinder, it's going to drop the pressure down. It's actually going to go into a negative pressure. And then again, as the piston starts to come back up, which would be on the normal power stroke, we just see some wave movement in the cylinder. Exhaust valve opens, again you see the pressure drop, and we move on and finish that stroke, and then the next event starts again. So you can start looking for things of when are the events happening, are they happening at the right time? And again, this is a pretty cool diagnostic process. One of the other things that's come along a lot lately is we get into gasoline direct injection. Gasoline direct injection is where now the injector, instead of putting the fuel behind the valves, is actually putting it right into the cylinder. So we've got now a higher pressure injector. This is nothing new to the diesel folks, but gasoline, probably 10 years or more this has been around. Again, this is a picture of our gasoline direct injection. We have a cutaway cylinder head, and just shows you the pocket up here of where the injector is placed. And there's a couple of different types of GDI engines. There's what we call the wall-guided swirl combustion. So this is where the injector kind of sprays the fuel at the cylinder wall, and the swirl is done that way. There's also the spray guided, where we might have the more centrally located injector, and we actually spray it down into the top of the piston. In either case, the piston may have some kind of pocket on it or whatever to help with getting the mix going on. Now, with GDI engines, there are a couple of different strategies as well. When we inject the fuel on the intake stroke, that's typically referred to as a homogeneous or homogeneous mix, meaning that it's going to mix well with the air. Another strategy that can be done is the stratified charge, where we actually spray the fuel during the compression stroke. And that actually, now, as we spray that high pressure fuel into a higher pressure cylinder, we get better disbursement. And the idea behind that is to try and use less fuel. And so we can actually get into a lean run strategy, or run, on fuel ratios in the 30-to-1 range in some cases. I've heard even leaner than that. But with lean air fuel mixtures comes some other issues. And one of the ones that's popped up with GDI engines over the last couple of years is something called low-speed pre-ignition. It's very prevalent in turbocharged GDI engines, caused by extreme cylinder pressures. It's very unpredictable. And like I said, usually it's not detected by our typical NOx sensors. And there's been some suspicion that oil might be a contributing factor. Now, if you go and do any research on this, you'll see that oil companies are working on some strategies with their oils to help. I wouldn't say that oil's all to blame, but again, a lot of damage, as you know, all the damage that could be caused by pre-ignition before, it's just accentuated with this low-speed pre-ignition. Again, if you do some research on this, you'll find a lot, and it's been around for a while. It's kind of strange when you hear it. If you're standing, I've had the opportunity to be around an engine or a vehicle on a dynamometer running, and in the dyno cell using the NOx sensor or whatever, you can't hear it at all. But we were in a place where we were running a car in a dyno, and we left and closed the door to the dyno cell. And once we had an insulating wall in between us, you could actually then hear the knock. It was a little bit odd. And I saw one article where an engineer said that what they did, they've been aware of it for quite a while, and they used a trick where they actually took a copper tube with a washer on it, and they would bolt that to the engine and run the tube outside the dyno cell, and they would go and listen to the end of the tube to see if they could hear the knocking sound coming through there. So one of the other things manufacturers are trying to do to get around this is they're looking for better quality fuel. So our typical octane ratings, 87 pump octane, mid-grade in that 88 to 90 range, premium 91 to 94. There's a proposal out there for a single grade 95 octane fuel. A lot of the manufacturers are saying if they had that, they could build better efficiencies into the engine. They could start using more of the turbocharging, even get into the stratified charge, which again is going to build more heat and create more LSPI. So some of the other benefits, an increase in fuel economy, running the higher compression engines, turbocharged engines, and an overall average price instead of, different prices for different grades of fuel. There would just be one price at the pump. And there are a couple of websites where you can go and do some research just to prove that I didn't make this up, that, automakers are pushing for a single fuel grade. And there's another one here from the Fuels Institute, and they've done a lot of research. So those are articles you can go and look up and see if you can, what you can figure out. Getting into catalysts. Catalysts have been the control we've had forever. Like I said, the idea of the old days is try and control the engine to feed this thing the right diet so that we can control the emissions. A lot of things in catalyst efficiency. Things to take away from this chart are, if you look up here, this engine was started cold, even though it's, so the 30 is really 30 Celsius. This engine was inside a classroom when I did this. So we were starting at room temperature for that day. We started the engine, and I want you to notice what the ignition timing did. It actually went to a -12, which means it was firing after top dead center. The idea behind this firing after top dead center and raising the RPM slightly is that it's going to create a flame in the exhaust pipe. And by doing that flame in the exhaust pipe, it's actually going to get the catalytic converter to light off very quickly. So as you see in here, again, these are Celsius temperatures, but in that 15 seconds, we're already nearing 200 degrees Celsius in the catalyst. So it didn't take long for that thing to get up and operating. So the quicker we get it online, the quicker this thing can go into emission controls. And like I said, just to prove that it, was at a cold engine, was at 32 degrees, and it only achieved 42 degrees Celsius in that amount of time. As we learned with Jeff last week, diesels have gone through quite a change. They've gone through electronics into EGR, diesel particulate, selective catalytic reduction. And the big thing next are NOx, particulate matter, or all the things that we tried to control in the past. But the next real thing in diesel engines is CO2. If you look at the latest EPA standard, the changes there were all around better fuel efficiency. The systems on the other side didn't really change a whole lot. They just wanted the engines to burn less fuel, which is going to give us less CO2 overall. So things like EGR, which still exist on trucks, use these large coolers trying to cool the amount of exhaust, which was another way that we do it, including the SCR we talked about last week. This is a picture of one of our diesel engine benches, and that whole stand beside it is the after treatment system. And again, the after treatment system. Now, might seem strange to bring this up when we're talking a lot about gasoline engines, but there are talks that we may be seeing SCR introduced in gasoline engines as well. Some of the work that's been going on for about the last 10 years is around passive SCR, which means we're going to use a three-way catalyst, and using the three-way catalyst and then running a slightly rich mixture. That three-way catalyst will actually produce some ammonia, and we're going to use that ammonia to work with the SCR instead of injecting DEF. So there's a way to get a passive SCR system. And like I said, they've been working on it for 10 years or plus. One of the things I learned a long time ago by going to the SEE Congress in Detroit is that, I went and spent a whole day there sitting in on seminars on variable valve timing or variable valve actuation, and even electronic valve actuation. And it was probably 15 years before I saw any of the vehicles that had the technology they talked about. So that was in 1995 when I first saw that. And it took quite a while before we started seeing those systems. So if they've been talking about this SCR system for 10 plus years in automotive, it's probably something that's coming before long. Other technologies out there right now that didn't have time to go into, but there's lots of work being done on variable compression ratios. Nissan actually has a vehicle out now that can change an eccentric in the connecting rods and actually change the compression ratio. So that'd be another thing I'd advise you to go and have a look at. I can quickly show you here that. So this is Nissan Motor Corporation. There's some videos there, but essentially they're using this rocker arm assembly that changes the compression ratio of the engine and uses a motor mounted inside or outside the crankcase that operates an arm that can operate that. The last couple things, if we have some gasoline direct injection units. This is our engine bench that Tim used a couple of weeks ago in his seminars. The version we were using with him had the new fault actuation system on it, but we have the GDI engine bench and the GDI cylinder head that I mentioned a couple times in our seminar today is also available as well. And it's a cutaway, so we've cut away a lot of the key components so you can actually see the actuation components and visibility of it. And with that, that's the end of the presentation, and I'll stop this.